The rumble of motorcycles echoed through the dense forest roads as 5 men, clad in black leather, roared into the parking lot of the small fishing town's lone diner. Their arrival disrupted the serenity of the evening, a peace punctuated only by the occasional cry of gulls. The locals inside froze mid-conversation, casting wary glances toward the newcomers. Emma sat in a corner booth, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She hated being noticed. Her modest clothing and quiet demeanor often invited cruel comments from people who didn't understand her world, especially strangers like these. Through the frosted window, Emma watched the bikers swagger inside, their heavy boots clanking on the wooden floor. They seemed to enjoy the tension they caused, smirking as they surveyed the room. One of them, a man with a snake tattoo winding up his neck, fixed his eyes on Emma. Well, what do we have here?" he sneered, pulling up a chair uninvited. The other bikers snickered, emboldened by his audacity. Emma's father, Jack, sat silently at the counter, hunched over a plate of fish and chips. His weathered face betrayed no emotion, but his sharp eyes flicked toward his daughter. Jack looked like any other aging fisherman, broad-shouldered but slow-moving, with hands calloused from years of hauling nets. What the bikers didn't see was the disciplined composure of a man who had once been a Navy SEAL. Snake Tattoo reached for Emma's wrist, his intentions as clear as the malice in his grin. In a flash, Jack was between them, his hand gripping the biker's arm like a vice. "Let go," Jack said evenly, his voice carrying a quiet authority. Snake Tattoo pulled back, startled by Jack's strength, but unwilling to lose face. "Mind your business, old man," he spat, but Jack's expression didn't change. "That is my business," Jack replied, his tone calm but unyielding. His stare cut through the room like a blade, silencing the bikers' laughter. For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a small nod, Jack let go. Emma stared at her father, a mix of fear and admiration blooming in her chest. Jack returned to his seat, but the bikers exchanged looks, already planning their next move. This wasn't over. "Before we dive deeper, what would you do if someone underestimated you or your loved ones? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to follow for more incredible stories like this one." The silence that followed Jack's confrontation with the bikers was fragile, like the calm before a thunderstorm. Emma couldn't shake the image of her father's iron grip, his unflinching resolve as he stared down Snake Tattoo. She knew the bikers wouldn't leave quietly, and her worst fears were confirmed when the crash from the pier jolted everyone in the diner. Jack burst through the door, his boots pounding against the wooden floorboards. Emma hurried after him, her heart thundering in her chest. The scene outside was a nightmare. The moonlight reflected off shattered glass and torn fishing nets strewn across the pier. Jack's old fishing boat, his livelihood, and the pride of years of labor, was in shambles. The bikers were there, smirking, their silhouettes framed by the faint glow of the town's solitary street lamp. Snake Tattoo swung a crowbar lazily, its metallic clink against the boat's railing sending a shiver down Emma's spine. "You didn't think we'd let you walk away after that stunt, did you, old man?" Snake jeered, tossing the crowbar from hand to hand. Jack stood motionless for a moment, his sharp gaze sweeping over the scene. His body was coiled, every movement deliberate, as though he were calculating outcomes in his mind. Emma tugged on his sleeve, whispering frantically, "Dad, let's just go. Call the sheriff. Please." Jack's voice was low, steady. "Go back inside, Emma." Her mouth opened to protest, but his tone left no room for argument. Reluctantly, she obeyed, retreating to the diner. From inside, she could hear the bikers' mocking laughter and Snake's voice calling, "Run, little girl. Daddy can't save you this time." But the man they underestimated wasn't just a fisherman. Inside, Emma grabbed the diner's landline and dialed every number she could think of. Jack's old fishing crew, the retired Coast Guard captain who lived down the road, neighbors who owed her father their loyalty for years of quiet service. Her voice trembled as she explained what was happening, but their responses were immediate and unwavering. "We'll be there," said Old Harry, who once weathered a hurricane at sea with Jack. Within minutes, Pickup trucks began arriving at the pier, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Jack's allies stepped out one by one, grizzled men with weathered hands, their faces grim with determination. Some carried tools, others makeshift weapons, and all carried the quiet resolve of those who had seen their share of danger. Emma stood in the diner's doorway, her breath catching as she saw the gathering force. These weren't just fishermen. They were a community united by trust and unspoken bonds. Snake Tattoo and his crew paused their destruction, their smug expressions faltering as the headlights multiplied. Jack stepped forward, now flanked by his allies. "You've made your point," Jack said evenly. "Now leave before things get worse." Snake grinned, though the confidence in his eyes wavered. "You think a bunch of old fishermen scare us? You don't know who you're messing with." "No," Jack said, his voice steel. "You don't." The two groups faced each other, the air thick with tension. Emma clutched her phone, ready to call the sheriff, but something told her this was a storm her father was prepared to weather. For the first time, the bikers seemed unsure. Their bravado flickered as they saw not just one man but a collective force, a community willing to fight for one of their own. And they were just getting started. Snake Tattoo glanced around, his grin growing strained. The bikers were used to intimidating isolated victims, not dealing with a crowd of determined men who moved as one. Jack's allies fanned out, blocking the bikers' escape route to the main road. The quiet hum of engines died out as the bikers turned off their motorcycles, their faces hardening into masks of defiance. "Looks like we got ourselves a standoff," Snake drawled, though his swagger lacked the edge it had earlier. Jack stepped forward, his imposing silhouette framed by the moonlit pier. "You don't want this fight," he said calmly. His allies remained silent but unyielding, their presence alone a statement. Emma stood at the diner's doorway, her fingers gripping the edge of the frame. She felt the weight of the moment, like the fragile balance between a wave crashing ashore or receding quietly. Snake snapped his fingers, signaling one of the bikers, a burly man with a scar running across his jawline, to grab a crowbar. The man moved deliberately, his eyes locked on Jack as he walked toward him. The message was clear. Intimidation wasn't over. The fisherman next to Jack, Old Harry, didn't wait. With surprising speed for a man his age, he stepped forward, holding a thick boat hook like a staff. He swung it once, the tip stopping inches from the biker's chest. "Don't," Harry said simply. The biker froze. His hand hovered over the crowbar as his eyes flickered to Snake. For a second, no one moved. Then Snake laughed. All right. We'll leave your precious little boat alone for now." The bikers began retreating to their motorcycles, their movements deliberate, their smirks forced. Snake lingered a moment longer, locking eyes with Jack. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not by a long shot." Jack didn't flinch. "It is if you're smart." With that, the bikers mounted their motorcycles and roared off into the night, the sound of their engines echoing long after they disappeared. The gathered fishermen watched until the tail lights were gone. As the tension eased, Jack turned to his allies, his shoulders finally relaxing. "Thank you," he said simply. Harry clapped a hand on Jack's shoulder. "You do the same for us." But Emma could see that Jack wasn't truly at ease. His sharp eyes scanned the damage to the boat, and his jaw tightened. The bikers would be back, and they'd bring more than crowbars next time. The next day, as the sun rose over the quiet fishing town, the signs of the bikers' anger began to show. The local grocery store, owned by one of Jack's old friends, had its windows smashed in the early morning hours. Further up the road, tires were slashed on several cars parked in front of the diner. Word spread quickly. Snake Tattoo's gang was marking their territory, showing the town who held the power. Emma watched Jack as he repaired his boat, his expression carved from stone. "We need to call the sheriff," she urged. Jack shook his head. "The sheriff can't stop this." "Not yet." "What do you mean, not yet?" Emma asked, her voice rising. Jack finally looked at her, his face weathered but resolute. "They're pushing to see how far we'll go. If we call the sheriff now, they'll just scatter and come back meaner. But if we're ready when they try to come down on us again, we can end this." Emma didn't fully understand, but the determination in her father's voice quelled her argument. By mid-afternoon, more trucks arrived at the pier, carrying lumber, tools, and supplies. Jack's allies had decided that waiting to defend wasn't enough. They needed to rebuild, reinforce, and show the bikers that the community wasn't backing down. As the sun set, Emma spotted figures across the street, watching from a distance. Two of the bikers leaned against their motorcycles, their eyes fixed on the bustling pier. "They're watching us," Emma said as she joined Jack near the boat. "Let them," Jack replied without looking up. "They're scouting, trying to figure out if they can scare us into stopping. But they're going to find out something else instead." "What's that?" Jack finally turned to her, his gaze unwavering. "They'll learn that some people don't scare." Night fell over the small fishing town, the salty air heavy with tension. At the diner, the usual hum of laughter and conversation was replaced with nervous whispers. Locals huddled together, their eyes darting to the windows at every distant sound of an engine. Emma sat in the corner, her fingers tapping restlessly on the table. Jack stood near the counter, speaking quietly with Harry and a few others. The room was filled with familiar faces, fishermen, shopkeepers, and even a retired schoolteacher who had taken up woodworking in his spare time. Each of them had come to stand with Jack, drawn by a shared sense of loyalty and anger at the bikers' audacity. Outside, the faint roar of motorcycles grew louder, and the atmosphere shifted. People tensed, glancing toward the door as if expecting it to burst open. Jack raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. "They're testing us," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "Looking for a reason to push harder. Don't give it to them. Stay inside, stay calm. Let them make the first move." The bikers didn't wait long. Snake Tattoo led the pack, his gang rolling into the pier's parking lot with a deafening roar. This time, there were more of them, at least a dozen, each more menacing than the last. They dismounted their bikes, swaggering toward the diner with the arrogance of men who thought they owned the town. Snake's voice carried through the night as he called out, "Hey, old man, you hiding in there, or are you ready to talk?" Jack stepped outside, the screen door creaking behind him. He stood on the diner's porch, his arms crossed, staring down the gang without flinching. "This isn't your town," Jack said firmly. Snake laughed, the sound cruel and sharp. "It's starting to look like it is. You gonna stop us?" Behind Jack, Harry and a few others emerged, their stances quiet but resolute. They carried no weapons, only the unshakable presence of men who had fought bigger battles than this. Snake's grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered, stepping forward with his hands outstretched mockingly. "Oh, look, the Senior Citizen Brigade. Cute." One of the bikers snickered, but it was short-lived. Jack took a deliberate step forward, his voice low but cutting through the night like a blade. "Leave now, or you'll regret staying." Snake's eyes narrowed, the bravado in his grin fading. He pulled a metal chain from his belt, letting it clink against the ground. "You think you scare me, old man? You don't know who you're dealing with." Jack didn't move, his gaze steady. "And you don't know who you've crossed." From the shadows behind the diner, more headlights flickered on. Trucks and old fishing boats parked on trailers rolled into view, blocking the road. Men and women, Jack's allies, stepped out, their faces hardened with quiet determination. Snake and his gang spun around, their laughter dying in their throats. They were surrounded. Harry's voice broke the silence. "We don't need trouble, but we won't run from it, either. You can leave now, or you can find out what happens when you push too far." For a long moment, the only sound was the distant crash of waves against the pier. Snake scanned the crowd, his confidence cracking. He hadn't expected this. These weren't frightened townsfolk. They were a wall of resistance, united and immovable. But Snake wasn't ready to back down. With a snarl, he raised the chain and took a step toward Jack. Before he could strike, a loud bang echoed through the night. The sound wasn't a gunshot, but the sharp crack of a baseball bat slamming into the side of a dumpster. Emma stood on the diner's porch, her hands shaking but her eyes fierce. "Enough," she shouted, her voice trembling but loud enough to cut through the tension. Snake turned to her, his sneer returning. "And what are you gonna do, sweetheart?" Jack moved faster than anyone expected. In an instant, he was in front of Snake, his hand gripping the biker's wrist like a vice. Snake yelped, his chain clattering to the ground. "This is your last warning," Jack said, his voice like iron. "Get out. Now." The bikers hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. Snake wrenched his arm free, snarling. "You think this is over? It's not. We'll be back." Jack stepped back, watching as the gang mounted their bikes. Their engines roared, and one by one, they peeled out, leaving the diner in a cloud of dust and exhaust. As the last motorcycle disappeared into the night, the tension in the air began to lift. The townsfolk exchanged wary looks, some shaking their heads, others nodding in quiet resolve. Harry turned to Jack. "You know they're not done, right?" Jack nodded. "I know, but neither are we." Inside the diner, Emma sat at the counter, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of coffee. Jack joined her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You were brave tonight," he said quietly. "I was scared," Emma admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Jack said, his eyes softening. "It's standing your ground in spite of it." Emma looked at her father, seeing him in a new light. He wasn't just the quiet fisherman she had grown up with. He was a man who would fight for what mattered, no matter the cost. The night was far from over, and the threat still loomed. But for now, the town had drawn a line in the sand, and they were ready for whatever came next. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the pier, illuminating the wreckage left behind by Snake and his gang. Broken planks of wood floated aimlessly near the dock, and shards of glass sparkled like jagged jewels on the ground. Jack stood at the edge of the pier, his hands on his hips, surveying the damage. Behind him, a small group of locals had already begun gathering, each one carrying tools, supplies, or simply a willingness to help. Harry was the first to break the silence. "We can fix this," he said gruffly, gripping a hammer in his weathered hand. Jack nodded, his face hard but determined. "We don't just fix it," he said. "We fortify it." Word spread quickly through the small fishing town. Jack Davidson was planning to take a stand against the bikers who had been terrorizing them. By midday, the pier and diner were alive with activity. Pickups and station wagons pulled up one after another, delivering supplies and people. A retired Coast Guard captain, Paul "Salty" Alvarez, arrived with a truckload of thick ropes and pulleys. "You're gonna need reinforcements if they come back," he said, unloading the gear. A local mechanic, Brenda, showed up with her teenage son, carrying chains, locks, and crowbars. "We can rig the doors and windows with these," she explained, her eyes scanning the diner. "Make it harder for them to bust in next time." Even the town's older residents got involved. Mrs. Jenkins, the retired schoolteacher, brought coffee and sandwiches to keep everyone fed. "Can't have you all working on empty stomachs," she said with a warm smile. But it wasn't just tools and food that came pouring in. People brought stories, memories of how Jack had helped them over the years. "Jack pulled my boy out of the water when his boat capsized," one fisherman said. "He fixed my generator after the last storm knocked it out," Brenda added. "I owe my whole business to him," the grocery store owner chimed in. "When my stock ran low last year, Jack organized the fishermen to help me restock." The tales piled up, each one painting a picture of a man who had always quietly supported his community. Now it was their turn to support him. Inside the diner, Jack worked alongside Salty and Brenda, reinforcing the doors and windows with metal plates. "They'll try to break us," Jack said as he tightened a bolt. "First with fear, then with brute force. But if we stand together, we can stop them." "Stand together, huh?" Salty said with a wry grin. "That sounds like something you'd say back when we were facing down pirates in the Gulf." Jack chuckled. Different kind of pirates, same fight. In a corner booth, Emma sat with Mrs. Jenkins, creating a list of who had pledged what. The page quickly filled with names, tools, and skills. Emma's pen moved quickly as she documented the town's growing resistance. "Look at this," she said, glancing up at Mrs. Jenkins. "So many people are helping. I didn't think." Mrs. Jenkins placed a comforting hand on Emma's arm. "Your father has always been the quiet anchor of this town. He never asked for recognition, but people remember kindness. Now they're paying it back." That evening, Jack called for a meeting at the diner. The tables had been pushed aside to make room, and the walls were lined with charts, maps, and hastily drawn plans. Jack stood at the center, addressing the room. "They'll be back," he began, his voice steady. "And next time, they'll bring more men, more weapons. They'll come expecting to scare us into submission. But we won't be scared. And we won't be unprepared." Harry stepped forward, pointing to a map of the town. "We've set up observation points here and here," he said, indicating the main roads leading into the town. "If they try to sneak in, we'll know." Brenda added, "I've rigged the diner's back door with a locking mechanism. They won't be able to break in without making a racket." Salty nodded. "And the pier's been reinforced. If they try to cause more damage, they'll find it's a lot harder than they think." Jack listened carefully, nodding at each suggestion. When everyone had spoken, he stepped forward again. "Thank you," he said, his voice carrying the weight of gratitude. "I know this isn't easy, but if we stand together, we can protect what's ours." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. As the meeting wrapped up, Emma stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The night was still, but the town felt different. Where there had been fear, there was now a sense of purpose. The lights from the diner spilled onto the street, illuminating the bustling activity inside. For the first time in days, Emma felt a glimmer of hope. They weren't just waiting to be attacked, they were readying themselves to fight back. Inside, Jack watched as his friends and neighbors worked together, their shared determination lighting a fire in his chest. Snake Tattoo and his gang had underestimated them. They'd seen only a quiet, isolated town. What they didn't realize was that this was a community forged in hardship, bound by loyalty, and unafraid to defend its own. And when the bikers came back, they'd learned that the hard way. The following morning, the town buzzed with a renewed energy. What had begun as a scattered effort to help Jack and Emma had transformed into a well-organized operation. Each person who arrived at the diner brought something unique to the table: skills, resources, and above all, a willingness to stand firm. Paul, Salty, Alvarez worked tirelessly by the pier, directing a small crew of fishermen to create barricades from old boat parts. "We're not just patching things up," he told the men. "We're building something that'll outlast those punks." Further up the road, Brenda and her son, Kyle, reinforced the diner's windows with heavy-duty shutters. Brenda wiped her brow as she stepped back to admire their work. "You think these'll hold?" Kyle asked, looking skeptical. "They'll hold," she replied firmly. "And if they don't, we will." At the diner, Emma was busy turning the dining room into a command center. Maps were spread across tables, marked with red and blue pins to show possible attack routes and safe zones. Harry sat nearby, radio in hand, coordinating with the handful of volunteers stationed along the town's perimeter. "Roads clear," came a crackling voice over the radio. "For now," Harry muttered, jotting down the report. He glanced at Emma, who was poring over the lists of supplies. "You're good at this," he said, surprising her. Emma blinked. "At what?" "At keeping it all together. Your dad must be proud." She smiled faintly. "I just hope it's enough." As the day progressed, more people arrived, not just locals, but faces Emma didn't recognize. Some were fishermen from neighboring towns, others were friends of Jack's from years gone by. Each arrival felt like a small victory, a reminder that the town wasn't as isolated as it had seemed. One of the new arrivals was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a military gait. He approached Jack at the pier, his presence commanding attention. "Dan Mullins," the man introduced himself, extending a hand. "We served together in the Gulf. Heard you've got a situation here." Jack's face softened with recognition. "Dan," he said, shaking his hand firmly. "Didn't think I'd see you again." "Didn't think you'd need me," Dan replied with a grin. He gestured to the pickup truck behind him, loaded with gear. "Brought a few things that might help. Reinforced steel, spotlights, even a couple of CB radios for communication." Jack nodded, his respect evident. You didn't have to do this. Yes, I did, Dan said simply. We look out for our own. By the afternoon, Dan had joined Salty and the others, helping to fortify the pier. He moved with the precision of someone who had seen his fair share of conflict, and his presence bolstered the confidence of everyone around him. Meanwhile, Emma was introduced to another unexpected ally. A retired school librarian named Clara, who most people dismissed as frail and elderly, arrived at the diner carrying a stack of old books and notebooks. What's this? Emma asked as Clara set the stack on the counter. Information, Clara replied matter-of-factly. She flipped open one of the notebooks, revealing meticulous records of the town's history. These bikers think they can break us, because they don't know who we are. But this town has stood against worse. Clara's notebooks detailed decades of storms, economic hardships, and even the occasional skirmish with outside troublemakers. Emma read through them, feeling a swell of pride for the resilience that pulsed through the town's veins. We've faced worse, Clara said, patting Emma's hand. And we've always come through stronger. As night fell, the preparations neared completion. The diner and pier had been transformed into a fortress, with barricades at every entrance and observation points strategically placed throughout the area. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but hopeful. Jack gathered everyone for a final briefing. They'll come back, he began, his voice steady but firm. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. But when they do, they'll find out they're not just facing one man. They're facing all of us. A cheer rippled through the crowd, and Emma felt her chest swell with a mix of fear and pride. Jack continued, stick to the plan. Don't act on impulse. And no one fights alone. As the group dispersed, Emma found herself standing by her father. Do you really think we can win? She asked. Jack placed a hand on her shoulder. It's not about winning, Emma. It's about standing up. If we do that, we've already won. The two stood in silence for a moment, watching as the lights of the diner glowed against the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of motorcycle engines echoed through the night. The night was eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of activity around the fortified diner and pier. Shadows danced across the walls as floodlights, newly installed by Salty and Dan, scanned the perimeters. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but resolute. Emma, stationed by the command center, watched her father, Jack, make his rounds, ensuring every detail was accounted for. Outside, Harry adjusted his binoculars, scanning the main road leading into town. Beside him, Kyle and Brenda stood ready, their eyes alert for the first sign of trouble. You think they'll try something tonight? Kyle asked, gripping the handle of a crowbar nervously. Harry's lips pressed into a thin line. They will. They can't afford not to. Near midnight, the hum of approaching motorcycles broke the stillness. The faint sound grew louder, becoming a menacing roar. Harry keyed his radio, his voice calm but urgent. We've got movement. Looks like a dozen bikes heading in from the west. Jack's voice crackled in response. Hold your position. No one engages until they cross the line. Emma glanced at the map spread before her. Red lines marked the designated boundaries, entry points where the bikers would find their first obstacles, barricades made of scrap metal, fishing nets, and repurposed boat parts. From her position inside the diner, Emma could hear the rumble growing closer. The tension in the room thickened as everyone braced for what was to come. Then the sound of screeching brakes echoed through the night. The bikers had reached the first barricade. Snake Tattoo's voice rang out, sharp and taunting. All right, old man. We know you're out there. Time to come play. Jack, standing on the diner's porch, exchanged a look with Dan and Salty. Let them talk, he said quietly. Through the binoculars, Harry saw one of the bikers dismount and approach the barricade. Snake followed close behind, a baseball bat resting on his shoulder. He smirked as he examined the makeshift blockade, then turned to his men. This all they've got, he sneered. Let's show them how real men handle obstacles. One of the bikers revved his engine, charging toward the barricade. The bike collided with the tangled nets and scrap metal, grinding to a halt as its front wheel sank into the debris. Snake's smirk faltered as the biker cursed, struggling to free his bike. From the shadows, Jack's voice carried across the road. "Leave now, and you can still walk away." Snake laughed, though there was an edge of uncertainty in it. "Or what? You gonna stop us with your fishing hooks and duct tape?" Jack didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand. Behind him, Salty and Dan switched on the floodlights, bathing the road in blinding white light. The bikers shielded their eyes, cursing as the sudden brightness revealed more of the barricades stretching down the road. And then they saw the silhouettes of Jack's allies, fishermen, mechanics, veterans, lining the defenses. Snake's bravado wavered. "You think this is enough to stop us? We've got more men on the way. You can't win this." Jack stepped into the light, his voice calm but unyielding. "This isn't about winning. It's about protecting what's ours.
Do you think you can take this town? Try.
But you won't leave here the same." Snake spat on the ground, motioning for his men to retreat back to their bikes. "We'll be back," he growled. "And when we come, it won't just be a dozen of us. You'd better be ready for war." As the bikers roared off into the night, the townsfolk slowly began to relax. But Jack's expression remained grim. "They're regrouping," he said, turning to Dan and Salty. "Next time, they'll hit us hard."
Dan nodded.
"Let them come. We've got more surprises waiting." Back inside the diner, Emma watched as the group reconvened around the maps. Brenda and Harry updated the others on their observations, while Clara, the retired librarian, jotted down notes on what had transpired. "What happens if they bring more men?" Emma asked, her voice tinged with worry. "They will," Jack said, his tone steady. "But we'll be ready. Every time they come, they'll lose more than they gain. We'll bleed them of their confidence, their resources, and their numbers." Harry leaned back in his chair, cracking a wry grin. "And if that doesn't work, I still have a few tricks up my sleeve." The room broke into low chuckles, the tension easing slightly. For the first time, Emma felt a glimmer of hope. As dawn broke, fresh faces began to appear in town. More allies from neighboring communities arrived, each bringing tools, supplies, and their own stories of defiance. Jack greeted them with quiet gratitude, his confidence growing with every new arrival. By midday, the diner was bustling with activity once again. The maps had been updated, the barricades reinforced, and shifts assigned to ensure constant vigilance. Emma stood at the doorway, watching the coordinated efforts unfold. For the first time, she understood the depth of her father's resolve and the strength of the community he had helped build. Whatever came next, they wouldn't face it alone. The morning dawned heavy with anticipation. Though the pier and diner were fortified, a tense quiet hung over the town. The bikers hadn't returned yet, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. Jack moved through the crowd of volunteers with his usual steady presence, offering reassurances and making final preparations. Inside the diner, Emma stood at the command table, organizing supplies and coordinating shifts. "Everyone knows their positions?" she asked, her voice calm despite her racing heart. Salty nodded. "Observation points are covered. Barricades are reinforced. If they come through the main road, they won't like what's waiting for them." As if on cue, Harry's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got movement, 30 bikes, heading in from the south. Looks like they've brought more muscle this time." The room stilled as the announcement sunk in. Jack grabbed the radio. "Everyone stick to the plan. Hold your ground, and don't act alone. We're in this together." The sound of engines grew louder, a low rumble that vibrated through the ground and up into the air. Emma peered out the window as the first wave of bikers appeared on the horizon. They came in tight formation, their chrome glinting in the sunlight. Snake Tattoo led the pack, his face twisted in a sneer, flanked by burly figures clad in leather vests. Behind them, a black van trailed ominously, its windows tinted. It was clear this wasn't just about intimidation anymore. They were bringing backup, and they intended to end this. Jack stepped out onto the diner's porch, his broad frame silhouetted against the rising sun. He crossed his arms, waiting as the bikers rolled into the parking lot. Snake dismounted first, slamming his boot onto the pavement. He looked around, taking in the barricades, the reinforced windows, and the determined faces of the townsfolk who had gathered behind Jack. "Well, well," Snake said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Looks like the retirement home got itself a makeover. I told you this wasn't over." Jack's expression didn't waver. "You should have stayed gone." Snake's smirk widened. "And miss the party? Not a chance. You've got one last chance to stand down, old man. Clear out, let us do what we came to do, and maybe we'll let you and your little crew walk away." Jack took a step forward. "This town doesn't belong to you. You want it? You're going to have to fight for it." Snake chuckled darkly. "That's the plan." Snake raised his hand, signaling his men. Several bikers charged forward on foot, wielding chains and bats. They made for the barricades, but Jack's crew was ready. The first biker swung a bat at the scrap metal barricade, only to find it entangled in a fishing net. Salty appeared behind him, wielding a heavy oar, and swung it into the biker's legs. The man crumpled to the ground with a grunt. At another barricade, Brenda and Kyle held their ground. A biker tried to climb over, but Brenda slammed a crowbar into the wood, dislodging him and sending him tumbling back into the dirt. Inside the diner, Emma directed the next wave of reinforcements. "Harry, keep your team on the main road," she called over the radio. "We need to hold them here as long as possible." Harry's voice came back, calm but firm. "Understood. They're bringing more, though. Be ready." The bikers regrouped quickly, this time attacking with more force. Snake himself led the charge, slamming a chain into one of the barricades. Behind him, the black van screeched to a halt, and several larger men emerged, mercenaries, by the look of them. They were armed with crowbars, hammers, and knives, their movements precise and coordinated. Jack saw them coming and motioned to Dan, time for the next phase. Dan gave a sharp nod and grabbed the radio. "Floodlights now." The floodlights blazed to life, blinding the advancing bikers. Some stumbled, raising their hands to shield their eyes, while others cursed and tripped over the obstacles in their path. Jack's allies didn't waste the opportunity. Salty and Harry's teams pushed forward, using poles and tools to knock the bikers off balance. Brenda and Kyle threw chains across the tires of several motorcycles, immobilizing them. Amid the chaos, Snake Tattoo spotted a weak point in the defenses. He signaled to a few of his men and veered toward the back of the diner, where the barricades were thinner. Emma, monitoring the scene from inside, saw them coming. "Dad," she shouted. "They're going for the back." Jack grabbed his radio. "Brenda, cut them off." Brenda and Kyle sprinted to the rear of the diner, arriving just as Snake and his men began tearing at the barricades. Kyle swung his crowbar at the nearest biker, knocking the weapon from his hands. Brenda followed with a swift kick, sending the man stumbling backward. Snake snarled, his patience running thin. He raised his chain, preparing to strike Brenda, but Jack arrived before he could swing. Jack tackled Snake to the ground, pinning him with a strength that belied his age. "You should have left when you had the chance," Jack growled. Snake struggled, but Jack's grip was unyielding. The bikers behind him hesitated, unsure whether to advance or retreat. The sound of sirens broke through the noise, growing louder with each passing second. Snake's head snapped toward the road, his eyes widening. "Back up," he spat. Jack didn't flinch. "Not mine," he said. State troopers' vehicles came into view, their lights flashing as they barreled toward the scene. The bikers panicked, scrambling to get back to their bikes. Some managed to escape, but others weren't so lucky. The troopers descended on the parking lot, rounding up stragglers and securing the area. Snake was hauled to his feet by one of the officers, his sneer replaced with a scowl. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed at Jack. "We'll be back. We always come back." Jack stepped forward, his gaze cold. "Next time, we'll be waiting." As the bikers were loaded into patrol cars, the townsfolk began to emerge from their defensive positions. Though the damage was significant, they had held their ground. Emma ran to her father, relief flooding her face. "We did it," she said breathlessly. Jack placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're not done yet, but this was a good start." The bikers had retreated, but the town's victory felt tenuous. As the state troopers escorted Snake and a handful of his men away, Jack couldn't ignore the cold look in Snake's eyes, a promise of more to come. The battle was won, but the war had just begun. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was a mix of exhaustion and determination. People patched up small injuries, cleaned up debris, and began taking stock of the damages. Salty leaned against the counter, nursing a bruised shoulder. "That was just round one," he muttered. Jack nodded. "They'll regroup, and next time they'll hit harder." Jack and Emma walked the perimeter of the barricades, inspecting the damage. Several sections of the scrap metal defenses had been breached, and the fishing nets were shredded in places. Brenda and Kyle were already working to repair them, while Dan repositioned the floodlights for better coverage. "You think we'll have time to fix all this before they come back?" Emma asked. "We have to," Jack replied. His voice was calm, but Emma could see the weight of the situation in his eyes. They reached the pier, where Salty was overseeing a group of fishermen reinforcing the dock. "We'll shore this up," Salty said as Jack approached. "If they try to come at us from the water, they'll find a nasty surprise waiting." Jack placed a hand on his old friend's shoulder. "Good work. Just make sure everyone gets some rest. We're going to need them sharp." Salty grinned. "Rest later. Work now." As the day wore on, reinforcements arrived, not in the form of law enforcement, but from neighboring communities. Word of the bikers' attack had spread, and people began showing up to lend their support. An older couple from a nearby town arrived with a flatbed truck loaded with timber. "Figured you could use some real barricades," the man said with a grin. A group of young men from a coastal town pulled up with crates of fishing hooks, ropes, and other supplies. "Heard you've got some pests to deal with," one of them joked. Even the retired Coast Guard captain brought more tools, along with a pair of his old crewmates. "We're not going anywhere until this is over," he declared. The influx of help lifted the town's spirits. People worked side by side, sharing stories and laughter despite the looming threat. Emma found herself inspired by their resilience. For the first time, she began to believe that they could withstand whatever came next. That evening, the diner transformed into a war room once again. Jack stood at the center, a map of the town spread before him. The group huddled around, listening intently as he spoke. "They'll come back with more men and better equipment," Jack said. "But now we know their tactics. We've seen how they move, how they think. That gives us the advantage." Dan pointed to the map. "We should reinforce these areas," he said, circling the weaker points in the barricades. "If they breach here, they'll have a straight shot to the pier." Salty added, "We can rig traps along the main road. Slow them down, force them to dismount. If we control their movement, we control the fight." Brenda chimed in, "And we should keep rotating shifts at the observation point."
TS.
"They'll try to sneak in under cover of night." Jack nodded, taking in every suggestion.
Good.
"Let's get to work." As darkness fell, the town braced itself for another attack. Volunteers patrolled the streets, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. Inside the diner, Emma and Clara manned the radios, coordinating reports from the observation posts. Harry's voice came through first. "Nothing yet. Just the usual quiet." A few minutes later, Brenda checked in. "Roads clear on the east side." The hours dragged on, every sound in the night amplified by the tension. A distant rumble of thunder added to the unease, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the storm brewing in the sky was a reflection of the conflict ahead. Around midnight, the quiet was shattered by the sound of revving engines. Harry's voice crackled over the radio, his tone urgent. "They're back. Looks like 20 bikes, maybe more." Emma's heart raced as she relayed the message. Jack grabbed his radio. "Everyone to your positions. Stick to the plan." The floodlights clicked on, bathing the main road in harsh light. The bikers came into view, their numbers larger than before. Snake was gone, but a new leader had taken his place, a towering man with a shaved head and a scar running across his cheek. He stepped forward, his men fanning out behind him. "You think you can scare us with your little barricades and your floodlights?" he bellowed. His voice was deep, almost guttural. We'll tear this place apart. Jack stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. You've made your threats. Now make your move. The man grinned, his scar stretching across his face. Gladly. The bikers surged forward, their engines roaring as they charged the barricades. The first wave hit hard, but the townsfolk were ready. As the bikers reached the barricades, hidden traps triggered, sending spikes up from the ground. Several motorcycles skidded to a halt, their tires shredded. From the shadows, Salty and his crew launched their counterattack, wielding poles and hooks to keep the bikers at bay. Brenda's team held the line at the rear, using chains and reinforced doors to block any attempts to flank them. Emma watched from the diner, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. They're holding, she said to Clara, her voice shaky but hopeful. For now, Clara replied. But this is far from over. The fight raged on, each side refusing to yield. Jack moved through the chaos like a force of nature, directing his allies and countering every move the bikers made. But as the night wore on, it became clear that the bikers weren't just here to intimidate. They were here to destroy. The clash reached a fever pitch as the bikers ramped up their assault. The barricades groaned under the strain of the onslaught, and the air was thick with the sounds of engines roaring, metal clanging, and shouted orders. Jack moved with precision, his years of military training evident in every decision he made. Near the front barricade, Dan Mullins had taken command of a small group, using a combination of improvised weapons and tactical positioning to hold back the bikers. "Hold the line," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. When one biker tried to climb over, Dan intercepted him with a quick jab of a wooden pole, sending the man sprawling to the ground. Meanwhile, at the pier, Salty Alvarez and his fishermen defended the waterline. A few bikers had attempted to approach via the docks, but they found themselves tangled in heavy fishing nets rigged with weights. Salty smirked as he hauled one of the struggling bikers out of the water, his wiry strength belying his age. "You picked the wrong town," Salty muttered, shoving the biker back into the waves. Emma stayed in the diner's makeshift command center, her eyes darting between the radio and the maps spread across the table. Reports from the front lines came in sporadically, each one painting a picture of a battle that was far from over. "They're testing the east side," Harry's voice crackled through the radio. "Reinforce it," Emma replied, relaying the message to Brenda and Kyle. "Don't let them through." Clara, the retired librarian, stood beside Emma, her expression calm but her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You're doing well," she said softly. Emma shook her head. "I feel like I should be out there." "You are where you need to be," Clara said firmly. "Your father trusts you to keep this together. That's no small thing." Emma nodded, drawing strength from the older woman's quiet confidence. At the rear barricade, the towering leader of the bikers, Scar, made his move. He wielded a massive sledgehammer, swinging it with brute force against the reinforced doors. Each impact sent vibrations through the barricade, the wood and metal creaking ominously. Brenda and Kyle stood their ground, but they both knew the barricade wouldn't hold much longer.
Dad.
Kyle shouted into the radio. "They're breaking through." Jack responded immediately. "Fall back to the secondary position. Don't engage directly." Reluctantly, Brenda and Kyle retreated, leaving the door as bait. As Scar smashed through, he and his men charged into the alley behind the diner, only to be met with a sudden spray of fire extinguisher foam, blinding them. Brenda emerged from the shadows, wielding a heavy wrench. "You're not as smart as you think," she muttered, taking advantage of Scar's disorientation to land a solid blow to his arm. He howled in pain, dropping the sledgehammer. Kyle joined in, using his crowbar to keep the other bikers at bay. Together, they managed to drive the group back toward the alley's entrance, buying precious time for the defenders. Seeing the bikers' forces spread thin, Jack seized the opportunity to strike back. He gathered a small team of his most trusted allies, including Dan and Salty, and led them in a counteroffensive. Moving quickly and decisively, they flanked the bikers' main group, targeting their motorcycles. Dan smashed the fuel tanks of several bikes with a sledgehammer, rendering them useless. Salty and another fisherman tossed chains across the tires of others, immobilizing them. Each act of sabotage chipped away at the bikers' confidence and resources. Scar, now regrouping with his men, saw what was happening and roared in frustration. "Get back there and stop them," he barked. But Jack was ready. As the bikers advanced, he triggered another trap, a hidden tripwire that sent several of them sprawling into the dirt. Before they could recover, Jack and his team descended, forcing them to retreat once again. As the fight dragged on, it became clear that the bikers' momentum was faltering. Their numbers were dwindling, their resources stretched thin, and their confidence shaken by the town's unexpected resilience. Scar, realizing the tide was turning, shouted for his men to regroup. "We're not done yet," he bellowed, but his voice lacked the conviction it had at the start of the battle. Jack stepped forward, his voice cutting through the din. "You are done," he said firmly. "You've lost. Leave now, and you'll keep what little dignity you have left." Scar glared at him, his chest heaving. For a moment, it looked like he might press the attack, but then he looked around at his scattered, battered men and the determined faces of the townsfolk standing against him. With a growl of frustration, he signaled for a retreat. The remaining bikers mounted their bikes and roared away, their departure marked by the fading sound of engines in the distance. As the dust settled, the townsfolk emerged from their positions, their faces a mix of relief and exhaustion. The barricades were battered, the pier was damaged, and the diner's exterior was scarred, but they had held their ground. Emma ran to her father, throwing her arms around him. "We did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack hugged her tightly, his own relief evident. "You did it, Emma. This town wouldn't have stood without you." Around them, people began to cheer, their voices rising in celebration. They had won this battle, and though the threat of the bikers wasn't completely gone, the victory was a powerful reminder of what they could achieve together. Jack looked out at the crowd, his expression resolute. "They'll be back," he said quietly to Emma. "But so will we." The morning after the confrontation, the town felt both victorious and fragile. The bikers had retreated, their threats carried off with the distant rumble of their engines, but Jack knew better than to trust the calm. As the first rays of sunlight spilled over the horizon, he stood alone at the pier, staring at the battered remains of his fishing boat. Emma found him there, his silhouette stark against the shimmering water. She approached cautiously, unsure if he wanted company. "You okay, Dad?" she asked softly. Jack didn't answer right away. His hands rested on the edge of the dock, his knuckles white against the weathered wood. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "Do you know why I left the Navy?" Emma hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I thought it was because of Mom, after she got sick." Jack shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "That's what I let everyone believe. But the truth is, I couldn't stay. I'd seen too much, done too much. I was tired of fighting." Emma frowned. "But you were a hero. You saved people." "And I lost people," Jack said, his voice tightening. "Good men who trusted me. Men I couldn't save. I thought if I came here, to this quiet little town, I could leave all that behind. Start over." Emma stepped closer, her heart aching for him. "But you didn't leave it behind, did you?" Jack looked at her, his eyes heavy with the weight of years.
No.
"It never really leaves you. It's always there, waiting for the next fight." As they stood in silence, Emma reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his calloused ones. "You're not alone this time, Dad," she said firmly. "You've got all of us, and we're not giving up." Jack squeezed her hand, a flicker of gratitude breaking through his stoic exterior. "You're stronger than you think, Emma," he said quietly. "Stronger than I ever gave you credit for." She smiled faintly. "I learned from the best." Back at the diner, the mood was less hopeful. While many celebrated their victory, others were less optimistic. A small group of townsfolk gathered in the corner, their voices hushed but their frustration clear. "This isn't sustainable," one man muttered, his face lined with worry. "We can't keep fighting like this. What happens when they come back with guns?" "We should have called the sheriff sooner," another woman said. "Or better yet, just let them take what they wanted. It's not worth the risk." Brenda overheard the conversation and bristled.
So, what?
We roll over and let them run the place? That's not who we are. And who are we exactly? The man shot back. A bunch of fishermen with pitchforks? This isn't a fair fight. Emma entered the room just in time to hear the argument. That's why we stand together, she said, her voice firm. Because if we don't, they win. And they won't stop with the diner or the pier. They'll take everything. The group fell silent, shame flickering across their faces. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and Emma could feel the unease lingering in the air. That night, Jack sat alone in the diner, nursing a cup of coffee as he stared out the window. The town had quieted, but his mind churned with worry. The bikers' retreat felt like a temporary reprieve, a pause before the storm returned with even greater force. Dan joined him, sliding into the booth across from him. "You look like hell," Dan said bluntly. Jack smirked faintly. "Feel like it too." Dan leaned back, studying his old friend. "You've got a good thing here, Jack. A family, a community that looks up to you. Don't let these bastards take it from you." Jack sighed. "It's not just about me. These people, they're not soldiers, Dan. They're good folks just trying to live their lives. I dragged them into this." Dan shook his head. "No, you didn't. The bikers did that. You're just the guy standing between them and the people they want to hurt. Don't lose sight of that." Jack nodded slowly, but the weight of responsibility still pressed down on him. Emma, too, found herself struggling with doubt. She spent the evening organizing supplies and checking in with volunteers, but the strain of the conflict was beginning to show. When she finally returned to the diner's makeshift command center, she found Clara waiting for her. "You've done well," Clara said, her tone gentle. Emma shook her head. "It doesn't feel like it. People are scared. Some of them are already giving up." Clara placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. "Fear is natural, my dear. But courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what's right despite the fear." Emma sighed. "What if it's not enough? What if we can't stop them?" Clara's eyes softened. "Then at least you'll know you stood your ground. And that's something no one can take from you." Later that night, Jack gathered Emma, Dan, and a few of the town's key defenders in the diner. He spread out a map on the table, his expression grim but determined. "We need to be ready for their next move," he said. "But this isn't just about defense anymore. If we're going to end this, we have to take the fight to them." Emma's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Jack pointed to a remote location marked on the map. "Their hideout. We know where they're coming from. If we can disable their base, cut off their resources, we can stop them before they regroup." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications. Finally, Dan spoke. "It's risky, Jack, but it might be our best shot." Emma looked at her father, her heart pounding. "You're really going to do this?" Jack met her gaze, his resolve clear. "It's the only way to protect this town, and I'm not asking anyone to go who isn't ready." Emma swallowed hard, then nodded. "I'm in." Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, pride and worry mingling in his expression. "Then let's finish this." The diner was a hive of activity as the core group gathered to plan their next move. The map of the bikers' hideout lay at the center of the table, lit by a single overhead lamp. Jack's finger traced a route through the surrounding woods leading to the abandoned warehouse where the gang was based. "We'll approach from the north," Jack said, his voice steady but intense. "They'll expect us to come from the main road, but this path here," he tapped a narrow, winding trail on the map, "gets us close without being seen." Dan leaned over the table, scrutinizing the map. "What's the plan once we're inside?" "We take out their bikes and their supplies," Jack replied. "We're not there to fight them all at once. This is about crippling their operation so they can't regroup." Salty crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. "And what happens when they catch us in the act? You know they're not going to sit back and watch us wreck their base." Jack nodded. "That's why we have a fallback plan. We create enough chaos to buy us time to get out. This isn't about taking them all down tonight. It's about making sure they can't come back stronger." Emma listened intently, her heart pounding as she absorbed the enormity of the task ahead. She had insisted on being part of the mission, but now that the moment was here, Doubt crept in. Jack noticed her hesitation and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Emma, I need you here," coordinating from the diner. "If something goes wrong, you're the one who can call for help and keep things moving." Emma shook her head. "No, I want to go with you." "Emma," Jack started, but she cut him off. "I can do this, Dad. I'm not just going to sit here while you risk your life. We've come this far together, and I'm not backing down now." Jack stared at her for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "All right, but you stay close to me and follow every order I give." "Understood?" "Understood," Emma said, determination hardening her features. The group split up to gather what they needed for the mission. Dan and Salty loaded the trucks with tools and supplies: bolt cutters, chains, flashlights, and cans of gasoline. Brenda and Kyle worked on rigging a distraction, a small explosive device made from fishing supplies, designed to create a loud bang without causing harm. Emma found herself helping Clara back at the diner. The older woman had insisted on staying behind, but she handed Emma a small, weathered book before she left. "What's this?" Emma asked. Clara smiled. "It's a journal. My husband kept it during his days as a Coast Guard captain. It's full of strategies and reminders for when things got tough. I thought you might find something useful in there." Emma flipped through the pages, her heart swelling at the sight of the handwritten notes and sketches. "Thank you, Clara." "Stay safe, dear," Clara said, squeezing her hand. Under the cover of darkness, Jack's team set out. They moved quietly through the woods, their flashlights dimmed, and their voices hushed. The air was cool, and the forest was alive with the rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. Emma stayed close to her father, her senses heightened by adrenaline. She clutched the handle of a heavy wrench, the weight of it both reassuring and terrifying. As they approached the edge of the woods, the warehouse came into view. It was a hulking structure, its rusted metal walls illuminated by the dim glow of a few outdoor lights. Bikes were parked in neat rows outside, and the muffled sound of laughter and music drifted through the open windows. Jack motioned for everyone to crouch. "This is it," he whispered. "Dan, you take the left side with Salty and disable the bikes. Brenda, Kyle, and I will handle the supplies inside. Emma, you stay near the entrance and keep watch. If anything goes wrong, signal us with the flashlight." Emma nodded, her grip tightening on the wrench. The group moved into position with practiced efficiency. Dan and Salty worked quickly, cutting fuel lines and loosening bolts on the bikers' motorcycles. Each hiss of escaping fuel felt like a small victory. Inside the warehouse, Jack led his team to a stack of crates marked with the gang's emblem. Brenda pried one open, revealing boxes of tools, spare parts, and cans of fuel. "Perfect," Jack said. "Start rigging it to burn." Kyle poured gasoline over the crates, while Brenda set up the distraction device near the back of the warehouse. "This'll give us a head start if they catch on," she whispered. Emma, standing near the entrance, kept her eyes fixed on the bikers outside. Her heart pounded as one of them stood and stretched, his gaze sweeping the area. For a moment, she thought he had spotted her, but then he turned back toward the others. She exhaled shakily, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline. As the group inside finished their work, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the warehouse. One of the bikers had stumbled across Dan and Salty as they worked on the bikes. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" the man shouted. The camp erupted into chaos. Bikers scrambled for weapons, and the sound of boots pounding on the ground filled the air. Jack cursed under his breath. "We're out of time. Light it up and fall back." Brenda lit a match and tossed it onto the fuel-soaked crates. Flames roared to life, quickly consuming the supplies. Emma waved the flashlight wildly, signaling the group to retreat. Jack grabbed her arm as they sprinted toward the woods, the glow of the fire lighting up the night behind them. Bullets whizzed past, and shouts filled the air, but the group managed to make it back to the safety of the trees. The group returned to the diner just as dawn broke. Exhausted but alive, they collapsed into chairs, their clothes singed in. Their faces streaked with dirt. Emma looked at her father, her chest heaving with each breath. "Did we do enough?" she asked. Jack nodded slowly. "We sent a message. And we bought ourselves some time. Now, we get ready for the next fight. The aftermath of the raid was a strange mix of triumph and unease. Back at the diner, the group rested briefly, but the tension hadn't eased. The bikers' warehouse was in ruins, their supplies burned, and their bikes sabotaged, but Jack knew retaliation was inevitable. The question wasn't if they knew it was coming, it was when and how hard. Emma sat at the counter, staring into a steaming cup of coffee. Her hands still trembled from the night's events, the adrenaline refusing to fully leave her system. Clara, ever the steady presence, sat beside her, flipping through her late husband's journal. "You did well out there," Clara said without looking up. "I was terrified," Emma admitted. "Good," Clara replied, finally meeting her eyes. "Fear keeps you sharp. Just don't let it paralyze you. You've got more strength than you think." Emma nodded, but her thoughts were heavy. The raid had been successful, but it had also shown her how dangerous the fight was becoming. People she cared about were putting their lives on the line, and every step forward seemed to bring them closer to disaster. Jack, meanwhile, stood outside the diner, staring at the horizon. Dan joined him, his hands in his jacket pockets. "Successful night," Dan said, breaking the silence. "For now," Jack replied. "But we didn't break them.
We just slowed them down.
They'll be angrier than ever, and they won't underestimate us again."
Dan nodded.
"That's true. But look at what you've done. You've rallied a town that was ready to roll over and give up. That's no small thing." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It doesn't feel like enough. Every time I look at Emma, I think about what could happen to her if we lose. If I lose." Dan placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Jack. Don't carry it all on your shoulders. Trust the people you've brought together. They're tougher than you think." Jack gave a faint nod, but the burden in his eyes remained. Later that morning, as the town gathered to regroup, tensions began to surface. Harry, the grizzled fisherman who had stood by Jack from the beginning, slammed his hand on the diner's counter. "We can't keep waiting for them to make the next move. We hit them hard last night, but if we give them time to recover, we're dead." "And what do you suggest?" Brenda asked, crossing her arms. "We march down there and finish them off. We're not soldiers, Harry. We barely made it back in one piece." "We need to call the sheriff," another voice chimed in. Jack stepped in, his voice cutting through the argument. "The sheriff can't protect this town from what's coming. If we don't stand together, we lose everything. But we have to be smart about it." The room quieted, but the cracks were clear. Not everyone was convinced they could win, and the strain was beginning to show. As the group dispersed, Emma found herself standing outside, staring at the burned orange sky of the setting sun. Clara joined her, the journal tucked under her arm. "Something's bothering you," Clara said gently. Emma nodded, tears brimming in her eyes.
"I'm scared, Clara."
"Not just of the bikers, but of losing everything. My dad, the town, this fight, it feels too big." Clara reached out and placed a comforting hand on Emma's shoulder. "Fear is natural, but it's what you do with it that matters. I've lived long enough to know that the hardest battles are the ones worth fighting." Emma wiped her eyes, determination hardening in her expression. "I'm not giving up. I can't. My dad's done so much for this town, for me. I won't let him carry this alone." Clara smiled. "That's the spirit. Now go show him." That night, Emma found Jack sitting alone at the edge of the pier, the moonlight reflecting off the calm water. She approached quietly, sitting beside him. "Dad," she began, her voice steady, "I need to know something. Are you scared?" Jack didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared at the water, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "Every day," he admitted. "I'm scared of losing you, of letting this town down, of not being enough." Emma reached for his hand, her grip firm. "You are enough. You've already done so much, Dad. But you don't have to do it alone. We're in this together." Jack turned to her, his eyes softening. "You remind me of your mom," he said quietly. "She had that same fire in her, that same strength." Emma smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Then we've got this, right?" Jack nodded.
Yeah.
We've got this. The following morning, the town gathered once again, their resolve renewed. Jack outlined the next phase of their defense, incorporating ideas from the entire group. We don't just hold our ground, Jack said. We make sure they can't even think about coming back. We fortify every weak point, prepare for every possibility, and we do it together. The room erupted in cheers, the cracks of doubt temporarily sealed by their collective determination. Emma, standing at her father's side, felt a newfound strength. She wasn't just a bystander anymore. She was part of the fight, and she was ready for whatever came next. The final confrontation began with an eerie stillness. The town had fortified itself to the point of resembling a battlefield. Metal barricades lined the streets, fishing nets hung ready to ensnare, and strategically placed floodlights waited to pierce the darkness. Every man and woman capable of fighting had a role, their faces hardened with resolve. Jack stood at the diner's porch, surveying the defenses. His daughter, Emma, was beside him, armed with a crowbar she had grown more comfortable carrying. Beside them, Dan and Salty double-checked their equipment, their expressions grim. The quiet was broken by the faint rumble of engines, a sound that grew louder with every passing second. Jack raised a hand, signaling the defenders to take their positions. From the high points, Harry and his spotters radioed in. They're coming in force, Harry's voice crackled. Dozens of them. Trucks, too. Jack nodded, gripping his radio. Stick to the plan. Don't engage until they hit the traps. The bikers roared into view, their numbers doubled since the last encounter. At the head of the pack was Scar, his scarred face twisted into a sneer. Behind him, a massive black truck rumbled forward, its flatbed carrying several heavily armed men. The sight was intimidating, but the townsfolk held their ground. Emma swallowed hard, her grip tightening on her weapon. Scar stepped off his bike, his boots crunching against the gravel as he looked around. You people really don't know when to quit, do you? He called out, his voice booming. Jack stepped forward, his voice steady. You've pushed us enough. This ends tonight. Scar laughed, shaking his head. You really think a bunch of fishermen and retirees are going to stop us? This town is ours. Jack's gaze didn't waver. Come take it then. Scar raised his hand, and the bikers surged forward. The first wave hit the barricades, their motorcycles skidding against the metal and wood. Hidden traps sprang to life, spikes puncturing tires, nets entangling wheels. Several bikers were thrown to the ground, their curses mixing with the roar of engines. From the rooftops, Harry and his team shone powerful floodlights into the attackers' eyes, disorienting them. Salty and his crew launched makeshift projectiles, metal pipes, weighted fishing hooks, and even buckets of oil to slick the ground beneath the bikers' feet. At the rear of the line, Scar barked orders, sending the black truck forward. The vehicle crashed through the first barricade, its reinforced frame shrugging off the defenses. Here they come, Dan shouted, signaling the second wave of defenders to fall back to the next line. As the black truck approached the diner, Emma's heart raced. She had been stationed near the back with a small group, tasked with holding the line if the attackers made it that far. The truck came to a screeching halt, and several men leaped out, armed with crowbars and bats. One of them advanced toward Emma, his grin menacing. You should have stayed inside, little girl, he taunted. Emma's fear surged, but she stood her ground. When he swung his bat, she sidestepped and slammed her crowbar into his shin. The man cried out, collapsing to the ground as she swung again, this time hitting his arm and disarming him. Another attacker lunged at her, but Brenda appeared, wielding a heavy wrench. Together, they drove the men back, their teamwork creating a formidable defense. At the pier, Jack and Dan faced off against the black truck. The vehicle had plowed through the final barricade and was now an unstoppable force heading for the heart of the town. We need to stop that thing.
Dan showed it.
Jack nodded, his mind racing. Get the cables. Dan grabbed a pair of thick steel cables rigged to a nearby fishing boat. As the truck barreled forward, Jack and Dan looped the cables around its back wheels, securing them to the pier's anchor points. The truck's tires spun wildly, the tension in the cables forcing it to a halt. The engine roared, but the vehicle couldn't move forward.
Now,
Jack yelled. Salty's team, stationed nearby, lit a row of Molotov cocktails and hurled them at the truck. Flames erupted across its flatbed, sending the armed men scrambling to escape. Seeing his men faltering, Scar roared in frustration and charged forward on foot. He wielded a sledgehammer, swinging it wildly as he advanced toward Jack. "You think this is over?" Scar snarled. Jack met him head-on, wielding a steel pipe. The two clashed in a brutal melee, each swing reverberating with raw force. Scar's strength was immense, but Jack's precision and discipline kept him in the fight. Around them, the townsfolk continued to drive the bikers back. Dan joined the fray, tackling one of Scar's men to the ground, while Emma and Brenda held their line at the diner. Finally, Jack saw an opening. Scar overextended with a wild swing, and Jack brought the pipe down on his wrist, forcing him to drop the sledgehammer. With a swift kick, Jack sent Scar sprawling to the ground. Jack stood over him, breathing heavily. "It's over, Scar. Get out and don't come back." Scar glared up at him, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You'll regret this," he spat. "I'll take my chances," Jack replied. With Scar down and their forces in disarray, the bikers began to retreat. The roar of engines filled the air as they fled into the night, leaving behind their broken vehicles and scattered weapons. The townsfolk watched in stunned silence as the dust settled. Slowly, cheers began to rise, spreading through the group like wildfire. They had done it. They had defended their town. Jack turned to Emma, his face softening. "You did good, kid." Emma smiled, her exhaustion giving way to pride. "So did you, Dad." As dawn broke over the battered town, the people gathered at the diner to assess the damage. There were injuries, and the streets bore the scars of the battle, but they had held their ground. Jack stood at the center of the room, addressing the group. "This wasn't just a fight for this town. It was a fight for who we are. And we proved that we don't back down." The crowd erupted into applause, their spirits lifted despite the challenges ahead. But as Jack looked out at the faces of his friends, his daughter, and the town he had fought so hard to protect, he knew the real victory wasn't just in driving the bikers away. It was in the strength they had found in each other. The aftermath of the bikers' retreat left the town in a surreal silence, broken only by the sound of the ocean lapping against the pier. Jack and his allies had won the battle, but the cost was evident in the tired faces around him. Despite the cheers and applause, the tension hadn't fully dissipated. Everyone knew that as long as Scar and his gang roamed free, the threat wasn't over. Inside the diner, Emma helped tend to the wounded. Brenda had a gash on her arm from a wild swing, while Dan nursed a cracked rib. The old wooden tables were transformed into makeshift medical stations, Clara moving between them with steady hands and a calm demeanor. "You should be proud of yourself," Clara said softly to Emma as they cleaned Brenda's wound. Emma shook her head. "We're not done. They're still out there." "You drove them off," Clara replied. "And you show them what this town is made of. That's not nothing." Outside, Jack and Salty stood near the smoldering remains of the black truck. Scar's last words still echoed in Jack's mind. "You'll regret this." Jack clenched his fists. Scar had retreated, but his defeat would only make him more dangerous. If the bikers regrouped and returned in greater numbers, the town might not survive another attack. Dan approached, his face grim. "We need to talk about next steps," he said. Jack nodded, his gaze never leaving the horizon. "He's not going to stop until he's got this town. We need to find a way to make sure he doesn't come back." "And how do we do that?"
Salty asked.
Jack's jaw tightened. "We take the fight to him." Later that evening, Jack called a meeting at the diner. Nearly every resident packed into the small space, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and determination. Jack stood at the head of the room, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "We've shown them that this town won't roll over. But this isn't over. Scar and his men are regrouping, and when they come back, it won't be like tonight. They'll come with everything they've got." Murmurs spread through the crowd, a ripple of fear passing over the group. "But we have something they don't," Jack continued. Each other. This town has faced storms, fires, and worse, and we've come out stronger every time. This is no different. Together, we can finish this. Dan stepped forward, his presence commanding. We've scouted their base. We know their weak points. If we hit them hard and fast, we can take away their ability to regroup. Salty chimed in. It's a risk, sure, but it's the only way to make sure they don't come back stronger. The room fell silent as the weight of the decision settled on everyone. Finally, Harry spoke up. You've had our backs, Jack. Now we'll have yours. One by one, others echoed the sentiment, their voices growing louder until the diner filled with a determined roar. Jack and Dan laid out the details of the plan. The group would divide into teams, one to create a diversion, one to disable the bikers' remaining vehicles, and another to secure the perimeter and ensure no reinforcements could arrive. We hit them at dawn, Jack said. When they're least expecting it. We move fast, get what we need to do done, and get out before they can regroup. Emma listened carefully, taking notes and memorizing the plan. She wasn't about to let her father go into the fight without her, though Jack had made it clear he preferred her to stay behind. You'll need someone to handle communications, Emma said later, cornering her father as he reviewed their supply list. I'm good at that. I can keep everyone connected. Jack hesitated, but Emma's resolve was unshakable. Finally, he nodded. All right, but you stay in the support team.
No heroics.
Emma smiled faintly.
No promises.
The town worked through the night, gathering supplies and preparing for the mission. Floodlights were repositioned to illuminate critical areas, while traps were reinforced with sharpened metal and heavier debris. Salty and Brenda rigged the last of the explosive distractions, testing each one carefully to ensure it would work at the critical moment. Emma stayed close to Clara, helping her pack a first aid kit. Just in case, Clara said, her voice calm but somber. By the time the sun began to rise, the town was ready. Jack stood at the head of the group, his eyes scanning the faces of the people who had chosen to fight alongside him.
This is it, he said.
We've faced them before, and we'll face them again. But today, we finish this. A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, their determination clear. As they moved out, Emma walked beside her father, her heart pounding with both fear and anticipation. She knew the stakes were high, but she also knew they had no choice. The town's survival depended on them. The bikers thought they had the upper hand. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The team moved through the dense woods in silence, the first rays of dawn breaking through the canopy. Each step was deliberate, the weight of the mission pressing down on them. Jack led the group, his senses on high alert, while Dan and Salty flanked the sides, watching for any sign of an ambush. Behind them, Emma kept pace, her flashlight tucked into her belt and her makeshift radio pressed tightly against her chest. She was nervous but resolute. This wasn't just about her father or the town anymore. It was about proving to herself that she could stand strong when it mattered most. As they neared the bikers' hideout, the faint sound of engines idling and the occasional burst of laughter drifted through the trees. Jack signaled for the group to stop, crouching low and motioning for Dan to join him. That's it, Jack whispered, pointing toward the clearing ahead. The warehouse loomed like a hulking beast, its corrugated metal walls glinting faintly in the morning light. A dozen bikes were parked outside, along with 2 black vans. A handful of bikers stood guard, their posture relaxed and unaware of the storm about to descend on them.
Dan smirket.
They're not expecting us. They will be soon, Jack replied. He turned to the group. You all know your roles. Stick to the plan and we get out of this alive. Let's move. The first phase of the attack went off without a hitch. Brenda and Kyle set off the distraction device, a small, controlled explosion, on the far side of the compound, drawing several guards away from the main entrance. As the bikers scrambled to investigate, Salty and his team moved in, sabotaging the bikes by cutting fuel lines and slashing tires. Jack led the main group to the warehouse's rear entrance, where Emma stayed behind to monitor the radios. Keep an eye out, he told her. Signal if anything changes. She nodded, gripping her flashlight tightly. Inside, Jack, Dan and Harry began their work. They located the bikers' remaining supplies, fuel drums, crates of weapons, and stacks of stolen goods, and methodically destroyed them. Harry planted makeshift incendiary devices, while Dan rigged chains to topple the shelving units. "We've got 5 minutes before they realize what's happening," Jack said, his voice low but firm. "Move fast." Outside, Emma watched nervously as the guards began to return from the distraction. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head, spotted the damaged bikes and shouted, his voice carrying through the compound. "They're here." The bikers sprang into action, grabbing weapons and shouting orders. Emma frantically radioed the others. "They know. They're coming your way." Jack's voice came back immediately. "We're almost done. Hold your position." Emma's heart raced as the bikers spread out, some heading for the warehouse while others scanned the woods. She ducked low, clutching her radio as footsteps approached her hiding spot. One of the bikers stopped just a few feet away, his eyes scanning the underbrush. Emma held her breath, her hand tightening around the flashlight. When he turned his back, she sprang into action, smashing the flashlight into the back of his head. The man collapsed with a grunt, and Emma grabbed his radio before darting deeper into the woods. "Dad," she whispered into her radio. You're surrounding the warehouse. You need to get out now." Inside the warehouse, Jack and his team heard the commotion outside.
"Time's up," he said.
"Blow it and go." Harry lit the fuse on the last incendiary device, and the group sprinted for the rear exit. As they emerged into the clearing, the warehouse erupted in flames, the fire consuming the supplies and sending thick black smoke into the sky. The bikers converged on the warehouse, their shouts of anger mixing with the roar of the fire. Scar appeared at the front of the group, his face a mask of fury. "Find them," he bellowed. "Kill them all." Emma spotted her father and the others emerging from the smoke and waved them toward her. "This way." The group ran toward the woods, but the bikers were hot on their heels. Gunshots rang out, bullets whizzing through the trees as the team ducked and weaved through the underbrush. Dan stopped abruptly, turning to face their pursuers. "Go," he shouted. "I'll slow them down." Jack grabbed his arm. "We stick together." Dan shook his head. "You're the one they're after, Jack."
"Get your people out."
"I'll catch up." Reluctantly, Jack nodded. "Be careful."
"Dan smirken."
"Always." As Jack and the others continued toward the rendezvous point, Dan set up a series of traps using the remaining chains and nets. When the bikers closed in, he sprung the first trap, sending several of them tumbling to the ground. He fought with the precision of a man who had spent years in combat, buying precious time for the others to escape. By the time Jack's group reached the safety of the town's perimeter, they were battered and exhausted but alive. Emma threw her arms around her father, relief flooding through her. "You made it," she said, her voice trembling. "So did you," Jack replied, his pride evident. Minutes later, Dan appeared, his clothes torn and his face bruised but victorious. "They'll think twice before chasing us again," he said with a grin. The town erupted in cheers, their relief palpable. For now, the bikers had been dealt a decisive blow. But Jack knew the fight wasn't truly over. "This isn't the end," he said quietly to Emma, "but it's a step closer." As the sun rose over the town, the people gathered to repair what they could and celebrate their victory. They were bruised but unbroken, a testament to the power of unity and resilience. And while Scar's threat still loomed, one thing was clear: this town wasn't going down without a fight. The morning after the climactic battle, the town woke to a strange quiet. The charred remains of the bikers' warehouse still smoldered in the distance, visible as a dark smudge against the horizon. At the diner, people gathered, weary but alive, exchanging cautious smiles. Jack stood by the counter, his eyes scanning the room. The townsfolk moved with slow determination, patching wounds, replacing broken furniture, and cleaning up the debris left by the bikers' retreat. For the first time in weeks, the sense of fear that had gripped the town seemed to have loosened its hold. Emma approached her father, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "You should sit down," she said, offering him one. Jack shook his head. "Not yet." Emma smiled faintly.
You did it, Dad.
We did it. Jack took the coffee, his expression softening. We held our ground, he said. But this isn't just about us. It's about what we do next. Throughout the day, the town came together to repair the damage. Brenda and Kyle reinforced the barricades, even as they joked about not needing them anymore. Salty and his fishermen hauled debris from the pier, while Clara helped coordinate supply donations from neighboring communities. The bonds forged during the battle were now the foundation for a stronger town. People who had once been distant neighbors now worked side by side, their shared struggle creating unity that hadn't existed before. Emma helped organize the effort, using the skills she had honed during the conflict. She kept track of supplies, delegated tasks, and ensured that everyone who helped was taken care of. Watching her father quietly direct the repairs, she realized just how much of him she had in herself. By midday, the sheriff arrived, his patrol car kicking up dust as it pulled into the diner's parking lot. He stepped out, his expression a mix of relief and irritation. "Jack," he called out, approaching with measured steps. "Heard you and your crew caused quite a stir last night." Jack crossed his arms, meeting the sheriff's gaze. "We did what we had to do." The sheriff sighed. "I'm not here to lecture you. Just came to let you know we picked up a few of those bikers on the highway, including their leader." "Scar?" Jack asked, his voice tense. The sheriff nodded. He and a few of his men were holed up in a rest stop a few miles from here. They're in custody now. A murmur of relief rippled through the diner. But Jack's face remained serious. "You think that's the end of it?" The sheriff shrugged. "Might be, might not. But after the message you sent last night, I don't think anyone's going to underestimate this town again." Jack nodded. "Thanks for letting us know." The sheriff tipped his hat. "You folks did good. Just don't make it a habit, all right?" That evening, the town gathered by the pier, lighting a bonfire to mark the end of their ordeal. The flames danced against the night sky as people shared stories of the battle, moments of courage, fear, and triumph. Emma sat beside her father, the warmth of the fire washing over her. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. Jack stared into the flames, his expression thoughtful. "Trouble has a way of finding its way back," he said, "but we'll be ready for it." Emma nodded. "I used to think this place was small, that it didn't matter much. And now?" Jack asked. Emma smiled. "Now I see how big it really is, how much it holds." Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, pride filling his gaze. "This town's lucky to have you, Emma. I'm lucky to have you." As the fire burned low, the townsfolk began to drift away, returning to their homes and their lives. The scars of the conflict would take time to heal, but the bonds forged in its aftermath were stronger than ever. Jack stood at the edge of the pier, staring out at the water. Emma joined him, the two of them standing side by side in comfortable silence. "They thought they could break us," Jack said quietly. Emma nodded. "But they only made us stronger." As the moon rose over the town, its light reflecting off the calm waves, father and daughter stood together, their resolve unshaken. Crossroads Diner wasn't just a truck stop anymore. It was a symbol of what a united community could achieve. In the days following the showdown, the town settled into a cautious rhythm. The adrenaline that had driven everyone through the battle was now replaced by quiet determination. Though the bikers were gone, the scars they had left behind, both visible and invisible, were reminders of the price of standing up. Jack walked through the pier, checking on repairs. Salty and Harry were there, hammering the final planks into place on a newly fortified dock. "This'll hold better than ever," Salty said with a grin, stepping back to admire their work. "Looks good," Jack replied. His approval carried weight, and Salty and Harry nodded with satisfaction. Further down the road, Brenda supervised her son Kyle as they repainted the diner sign, which had been damaged during the chaos. "We'll make it better than before," Brenda said, her voice full of determination. Inside the diner, Clara was sorting through donated supplies, blankets, tools, and canned goods sent by nearby communities as gestures of solidarity. She hummed quietly as she worked, her steady presence a comfort to everyone who passed by. Emma had taken up a leadership role without even realizing it. As people came to her with questions, ideas, and updates, she responded with calm efficiency. She no longer felt like the quiet observer in her father's shadow. She was part of the town's beating heart now, and she embraced the role. At one point, Brenda approached her, holding a clipboard. "We've got volunteers for the next phase of repairs," Brenda said. "What do you think we should tackle first? Fencing around the diner or the water line at the pier?" Emma didn't hesitate.
Pier.
"If another storm hits, we'll need it in good shape. Let's make sure it's reinforced properly this time." Brenda nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "You're good at this, you know." Emma blushed. "I just do what needs to be done." "That's leadership," Brenda replied simply. One evening, as the day's work wound down, Jack sat with Dan on the diner's porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "You did a lot more than just fight, Jack," Dan said, breaking the comfortable silence. "You gave this town a backbone." Jack shook his head. "They had it all along.
They just needed to see it. Then smell it."
Maybe, but they needed someone to show them how to use it. Jack leaned back in his chair, the weight on his shoulders a little lighter than before. "I thought I left this kind of thing behind when I left the Navy," he admitted. "But I guess some fights find you no matter where you go."
Dan nodded.
"The trick is knowing which ones are worth it." Jack glanced toward the diner, where Emma was laughing with Brenda and Salty. This one was worth it. As the weeks turned into months, the town began to rebuild not just its structures, but its spirit. The once isolated community now felt more connected than ever. Neighbors who had rarely spoken before now worked side by side, sharing meals and stories as they fortified their defenses and planned for the future. The Crossroads Diner became the unofficial headquarters for the town's efforts, its walls adorned with photos and notes of gratitude from people who had been part of the fight. Emma added a new section to the diner's menu board, a wall of heroes, where each person who had contributed to the town's defense could leave their mark. Jack resisted at first. "I'm not much for plaques and tributes," he said. But Emma wouldn't hear it. "It's not just about you, Dad. It's about all of us." When Jack finally relented, he found himself unexpectedly moved by the sight of the wall, a living testament to the strength of the people he had fought alongside. One quiet morning, Jack and Emma stood together at the edge of the pier, watching the sunrise. The water was calm, the town peaceful. "Do you think they'll ever come back?" Emma asked softly. Jack considered the question. "Maybe," he said finally. "But if they do, they'll find us ready. This town isn't the same as it was before. Neither are we." Emma nodded, her gaze steady. "They thought they could break us." Jack smiled faintly. "But they only made us stronger." As the first light of dawn spread across the horizon, father and daughter stood together, united not just by blood, but by the battle they had shared. Crossroads Diner wasn't just a truck stop anymore. It was a beacon of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, a united community could prevail. The weeks that followed were a period of quiet reflection and steady progress. The town had changed, not just in its physical repairs, but in its spirit. It felt stronger, more unified, and no one was eager to return to the way things were before the bikers arrived. Jack and Emma stood side by side in the diner one evening as the last of the day's volunteers left. The light from the setting sun poured through the windows, casting a warm glow over the space. The air smelled of coffee and fresh paint, mingling with the faint tang of the sea. "You've built something special here," Jack said, his voice low but full of pride. Emma glanced at him, surprised. "You mean we built it?" Jack smiled. "Maybe, but you're the one keeping it going." At the diner's counter, Clara was sorting through a stack of letters and postcards. Many were from neighboring towns, thanking Crossroads for inspiring them to stand against outside threats. Others were from the townsfolk themselves, expressing gratitude to one another. Emma picked up one of the letters, its handwriting uneven but heartfelt. It was from Brenda, thanking Jack and Emma for helping her see the strength she hadn't realized she had. "She always had it," Emma murmured. Clara looked up, her expression kind. "Sometimes it takes a storm to remind us what we're capable of." The quiet was interrupted by the sound of a motorcycle engine approaching. Emma stiffened, her hand instinctively moving toward the crowbar she had kept since the fight. Jack raised a hand, calming her. "Let's see who it is first." The door creaked open, and a man stepped inside, a lone biker, unarmed, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. He was older, with a grizzled beard and a patched leather jacket. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the man said, his voice rough. "Just came to deliver a message." Jack studied him for a moment, his stance wary but non-aggressive. "What message?" The biker shifted uncomfortably under Jack's gaze. "Scar's done. His men scattered after what you pulled at the warehouse. Most of them want nothing to do with this place anymore." "And Scar?" Jack asked, his tone even. The biker hesitated. "He's licking his wounds somewhere, but he's not coming back. You made your point loud and clear." Jack exchanged a look with Emma, then nodded. "That's good to hear." The biker lowered his hands, his posture relaxing slightly. "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing. Some of us were not all bad. But Scar? He got what he deserved." With that, the man turned and left, the roar of his bike fading into the distance. That night, Jack and Emma sat together on the porch of their home, watching the stars. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of salt and wood smoke. "Do you think it's really over?" Emma asked. "For now," Jack replied. "But it's never really over, is it? There's always another challenge, another fight." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "But we'll face it. Together." Jack smiled. Together. As the stars twinkled overhead, Emma felt a quiet sense of peace. The fight had been brutal, but it had also shown her the strength of her father, her town, and herself. They had survived. They had won. And they were ready for whatever came next. The end.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.